Good morning, folks. Welcome back to Three's End. Today, I'm going to start out by giving you an appreciation of what the scope of our operations was in the mid-70s with respect to flight operations. I think it's germane to the stories I tell about UPT and how we operated, what we were faced with, and so forth. When I went through pilot training in 1970-71, class 7107, we were training 2,500 pilots a year to support the Vietnam War. Now, in order to produce 2,500 pilots, we had to bring in 5,000 applicants. We had a 50% washout rate. That means that when we got in that room that day, when Booger Malone says, "Take a look to the left," he says, "That guy's not going to be here when you graduate." He was pretty close to it. At any rate, when I came back to the pilot training environment in the mid-70s, 1975, the production had dropped off as the war had wound down. And I imagine we were training about 1,800, maybe 2,000, 1,800, somewhere in that neighborhood. So we were still at a relatively moderate tempo, and we had not really seen severe cutbacks at that time. But we were starting to see them. So took a few notes here, and it helps to have the notes right side up. At any rate, the Vietnam War was winding down, so we weren't needing as many pilots, and we also weren't needing as many instructors. And so they began a purge at that time. The Air Force calls it a RIF, a reduction in force. And I personally met a guy, and I can't tell you his name today. Perhaps at one time I just had met him. I was brand new to the squadron. It was within 2 to 3 weeks in June when I was there. This guy had gone out and flown, and when he came back, there was a note on the softball in the parachute room. Now, what they did, they took these pegs, and they had put a softball on the peg. It was a steel peg, and they put a softball on that peg, and then that's where we would hang our helmets. Well, there was a note on the softball, and in retrospect, usually you didn't want to see a note on your softball. That, usually, "Hey, Bob, see ops officer," right away. And they didn't call you down for good news, usually. But anyway, so this guy had a note to go see the ops officer, and when he did, he had been advised that he had had his last flight in T-38, and he had 2 weeks to out-process. The Air Force no longer had need of his services. And that's the way he found out he was getting out of the Air Force. At any rate, in the mid-70s at Vance Air Force Base, we were still, like I said, fairly active. We had a cap of usually 99 to 101, sometimes 97 airplanes per day. What that meant was that was a contract with maintenance to provide 99 airplanes we'll use for us to meet our mission requirements. Now, the way the squadron was set up in those days, it's pretty much like it is today, I imagine, maybe not as many flights, is we had a squadron, and in my case, it was the 25th Flight Training Squadron Advanced, and in that squadron were 8 flights. I was in O flight. My whole time I was in that squadron, and so we had, in O flight, we would have, at that time, anywhere from 20 to 25, 26 students per class. Okay, so based on that student load, we would be assigned a certain number of airplanes to provide to meet our mission requirements. So overall, the squadron would get a cap of 99 airplanes for all 8 flights to fly their respective missions. Now, we would have 99 airplanes, and of those 99, with those 99, they would fly those airplanes 4 times a day. That meant if you take it and you put it out in daylight hours, we had a takeoff every 3 minutes during that time period. So every 3 minutes, there was another airplane rolling down a runway. Now, it wasn't quite exactly like that because in formation flights, we'd take two of the airplanes, put them together, and so you'd have a gap of 6 minutes or whatever it was. Or in a four ship, that would kind of stretch that out a little bit. But it gives you an appreciation for the intensity of our operation. And keep in mind that of all these sorties, half of them were flown by non-rated pilots, by student pilots, pilots without wings. And during the 4 years that I was at Vance, I was there from January 1975 through November 1978. We only lost two airplanes. We lost a T-38 on a circling approach up at Richards Gebaur, where they stalled and crashed. And then we lost a T-37 going to the auxiliary field. Now that tweet, and I'll tell a story of that in another video, that one did not have to happen. That was flown by flight commander and his assistant flight commander going up to the base to open up for operations that day. And they were screwing around and they primed it on the runway. Actually, they hit in the overrun. But be that as it may, we didn't have to have that airplane. At that time, Vance had gone 4.5 years without a tweet accident. And that broke that record. Anyway, back to the story. So every 3 minutes we launched a jet. Now, if you had weather come in and we couldn't fly, then that mandated we a trip turn. We fly. Usually, an instructor pilot would come in and he'd have 2 events per day: a flight and a simulator, or 2 simulators, or 2 flights. But if we got behind the proverbial timeline, then we would have to trip turn or fly 3 times a day. Oh, throw me in that briar patch. You know, when you're young, you're 27, 28, instructor pilot flying T-38. Oh man, it just didn't get any better than that. And little did we know just how much fun we were having in those days. We would take off on a 38 ride, to give you an example. In the summertime, it was hot as hell at Vance, but at least it was windy. So we would take off, and during that flight, depending on what kind of mission it was, you could lose anywhere from 3 to 5 pounds per flight just because of fluid loss. So we'd have to come back and drink a ton of water, and they had these salt tablet dispensers throughout the squadron. So we would drink water and take salt tablets. And of course, we drank the proverbial cup of coffee, which really wasn't, when you consider dehydration, that worked the other way. But anyway, I don't want to digress here too much. So we would trip turns, and on occasion, we get so far behind timeline, we would be called in on Saturdays to fly. But those were few and kind of far between. But there's usually amount of carping, so that the heavies, the upper management, would think we were unhappy with it, but really we didn't mind. Okay, in order for us to conduct these operations with a class of 20 to 25, we had what we called early week, late week. Now, what that meant was we'd take a class of 50, for the conversation here. Half would be in A section, and the other half would be in B section, or section 1 and section 2. And we couldn't fly the whole class of 50 at the same period during the day. So half the class would come to the flight line, while the other half would go to academics. And then around noon, 1 o'clock, we would switch. We'd bring them back. We'd bring the academic guys down to their flight, their sister, like our sister flight, and our guys would go up to academics. And then the next week, we would reverse the process. So you were always doing early week, late week. And early week would start around 5 in the morning, sometimes 6. And late week would end up around 4:30 or 5. Now, if we were, just for example, we were on early week, okay, we would show up at 5 o'clock for a report time, go out and fly a couple sorties, and then by noon, 1 o'clock, we were wrapping up our side of the house as our guys went up to academics. So that freed us up for the afternoon, where we could get caught up on paperwork, we could get caught up on CT, continuation training missions, which meant that we could go out and fly for proficiency for ourselves. Because often during student rides, we had to give the majority of the stick time to the student, and you'd expect that. So we'd go up with 4 IPs in a formation, or just a couple IPs, go up for instrument sorties, or we'd take our check rides on the off time. So it worked very well. And like I said, I look back at that and I think a takeoff every 3 minutes, flown by non-rated guys, and we only lost 2 airplanes, which is tragic for the 2 fellows that were killed in the one crash. And it still kind of haunts me because I had seen Jim that morning as he was walking out to fly. I saw him in the hallway, and I remember distinctly saying, "Hey, Jim, how's it going?" He says, "Wow, pretty good." And then when I came back from my flight, I had a local flight. It turns out he was doing a navigation sortie up to Richards Gebaur and in Kansas. And so when I came back from my flight, the squadron had been locked down, and that's when I learned we had lost Jim. And that's kind of bothered me ever since. I didn't know him that well, but he was one of our squadron mates, and those kind of things just would tend to bother me. But anyway, we'll put that in another basket for another day, maybe. So now you have an idea of what we were dealing with as far as the tempo of the operation in the mid-70s. And that continued probably through 78, 79, and then began to drop off a little bit. And it eventually dropped off through the 80s to where our pilot production dropped down to about 800, 900 a year. So now you have an idea what we were dealing with, and then you throw the students in the mix, you throw additional duties in the mix. We had a lot to do. Thanks for tuning in this morning. Good to see everyone.